Hello, welcome to Blog Talk Radio. My name is Kathy, and I'm a graduate student at the University at Albany in the Social Welfare Program. Today I'm starting a three-part informational discussion on human trafficking. January is Human Trafficking Awareness Month, so I have with me Caitlin, who is also a graduate student at the University of Albany, and she is interning with the International Organization for Adolescents. Caitlin has been working on a statewide program addressing issues regarding minor trafficking in New York. So welcome, Caitlin.
Thanks, Kathy. I'm really excited to talk about this topic that I'm really interested in, and I'm hoping to be able to teach everyone a little something.
Well, I know I'm ready to learn. I don't know a lot about human trafficking, so let's start with the basics. What actually is human trafficking?
Human trafficking is a pretty big, complicated question, which we're going to be covering in depth through this whole series. But to put it very simply, human trafficking is the practice of exploiting people as commodities in conditions of sexual and labor servitude. It's also very common nowadays to hear human trafficking called modern-day slavery.
Modern-day slavery.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I'd heard that term before. I have heard about smuggling and trafficking, though. Are they the same thing?
They actually aren't, and it's actually really common to confuse trafficking with smuggling. One of the things we often hear when talking about trafficking is someone can't be trafficked because they're not from Mexico. So what smuggling is the unauthorized crossing of an international border, while trafficking is, again, exploiting a person as a commodity. And so while a person can be moved across an international or state borders to be trafficked, it's not necessary. You can be trafficked in your own house. So again, to put it kind of simply, smuggling is transportation-based and trafficking is exploitation-based. Smuggling is a crime against a country and trafficking is a crime against a person.
So you're saying that someone who has been smuggled can also be trafficked?
That's right. So, a person can be smuggled into a country and then their smuggler will tell them, hey, you owe me additional money for helping you cross the border. And then when they don't have the money, they're like, oh, well, I have a way for you to pay me back. You're going to sleep with these people, or you're going to go work for this company. This is often called debt bondage. Another thing that can happen is a person from another country is told, hey, I have this wonderful job opportunity for you in America. And when they get to America, they find out the job is nothing like they've been promised, and everything's completely changed from what they were originally talked about.
So how big is trafficking worldwide or even just statewide?
Human trafficking is a major problem. Trafficking is actually considered to be one of the largest growing criminal enterprises in the world. There's an estimated 2.9 million people enslaved worldwide. And human trafficking is something, whether we know it or not, touches our lives in some way every single day, from the clothes we wear, to the food that we eat, to even the clients that we serve. Speaking in our own state, in New York is actually considered to have one of the worst human trafficking problems in the whole country. New York consistently ranks one of the worst 4 states nationally after California, Florida, and Texas.
Now, is there a reason why New York is rating one of the worst?
New York is really attractive to traffickers. We have a very extensive throughway system that connects our whole entire state to make transportation really easily. It's also really easy to get to other countries. We're right on the Canadian border. Also to major cities. New York City is really close to get to. Quebec, Boston. We also have a very large college system, which is also very attractive, and even we have a very good agricultural system. And so agricultural trafficking is also very common in New York State.
So as a social worker, tell me what trafficking means to social workers.
Well, trafficking, I think, is really important to social workers and to just even know about the problem, because we work with and interact with people who've been trafficked probably every day, and we don't even realizing it. Speaking from personal experience, one of my first jobs, I worked in a residential group home with teen mothers. And it isn't until recently that I realized that probably a lot of them were survivors of trafficked and were probably being trafficked in my group home while I was working there. And since I didn't know the signs, I didn't know what trafficking was, I couldn't address it and couldn't give them the services that they needed.
Now, are there different kinds of trafficking, and can you tell me a little bit about them?
There are. The 2 major ones are labor trafficking and sex trafficking. So labor trafficking is compelling or inducing another to engage in labor, or recruiting, enticing, harboring, or transporting another by providing drugs, withholding or destroying government documents, debt servicing, force, or a planned or pattern of coercive conduct. So an example of labor trafficking would be, let's talk about agricultural trafficking, because that's actually really common in New York State. So where I grew up, there was a lot of apple farms. So let's say you're an adult and you show up to an agricultural farm. They're like, hey, we will give you housing, we'll give you food, you just need to work for us, and we'll pay you. But at the end of the day, you have no money because all your money is going to your food and lodging. And then to make matters worse, they're like, well, you owe us all this money for feeding you, for lodging you, and you never are able to pay that back. Also, what's really common with labor trafficking is they'll take away your documents. This is really common with people who are in the country illegally. So they'll take away your documents and they'll threaten to call immigration if you try to go to the police.
So that's labor trafficking, and this is something that's very common.
Yes, very, very common.
And sex trafficking?
So New York defines sex trafficking as profiting from prostitution by providing drugs, using false or misleading statements, withholding or destroying government documents, debt servicing, force, or a planned pattern of coercive conducts. It's important to note that under federal law, any person under the age of 18 who has been sexually exploited is a victim of trafficking.
So let me see if I understand this correctly. So trafficking, it's not actually moving somebody somewhere. It's denying somebody something for what they've done that they've been promised.
Right. Not even just denying something what they've done. It's, again, that idea of exploitation and profiting off of another person.
Now, is there a difference, or how big is the difference between the child sex trafficking, which is what we're kind of focusing a lot on today, as opposed to adult sex trafficking?
So the big difference is actually like a legal difference. There's this element that needs to be present for all forms of trafficking, labor trafficking and sex trafficking. Evidence of force, fraud, or coercion. So you need to prove one of those elements were present for it to be trafficking. This is not required for minors because if you think about it, with minors, if you're under 18, you can't consent to sex. So if you're under 18, how can you consent to commercial sex?
That makes sense. Commercial exploitation of children, to me, that is, I'm thinking pornography and videos and pictures of children in sexual acts. Am I understanding that correctly, or is there more to that?
There is a little bit more to that. So there's this thing called commercial sexual exploitation of children, or CSEC. So CSEC is a form of child sex abuse, and it is exactly what it sounds like. It's a commercial transaction that involves a sexual exploitation of a child. So this means that any time a commercial is involved in commercial sex, including images of child sex abuse, child pornography, exotic dancing or performance, stripping, transactional or survival sex, cyber enticement, sex tourism, and sex trafficking. But keep in mind, it has to be a commercial transaction. So let's just take, for example, child pornography. If a person takes sexually explicit photographs or videos but doesn't profit for them, and the child does not receive anything either, then it's just child sex abuse. It doesn't become CSEC until there's that commercial exchange.
And how is what was that, CSEC?
Yep, CSEC.
How is that different from sex trafficking?
They aren't different. Sex trafficking is just one small portion of CSEC.
I'm just trying to picture this all in my head. So CSEC it encompasses all of it?
Right. So actually, if we look at a very big wide-scale thing. Let's look at this at kind of like a CPS level. So with CPS, you deal with abuse and neglect. And within abuse, there's physical abuse, sexual abuse, and emotional abuse. Within sexual abuse, there's sexual abuse, which is just the general one, and then CSEC, which is the commercial exploitation of a child. And then within commercial exploitation of a child, there's all those things I listed before, and also sex trafficking.
Okay. So what are the elements then that we need to know about in human trafficking?
Well, like I mentioned before, there's the three things of force, fraud, or coercion that need to be present to prove trafficking for anyone who's not under 18 and is being sex trafficked. Force, it can be confinement, physical assault, sexual assault, rape, food and sleep deprivation, drug administration, and kidnapping. Fraud is fraudulent employment offers or contracts, false promises about work and living conditions, false promises of education, withholding wages, false promises of love or marriage. Coercion is threats of deportation or arrest. Blackmail, threats to life or personal safety, family members or other victims, debt bondage, withholding of legal documents, and psychological manipulation. So again, we see a lot of these force, fraud, and coercion techniques to control minor sex trafficking victims, but it doesn't have to be present for them to be able to get services.
There's a lot of information here.
There is. It's like I said before, it's a very complex and in-depth problem.
So let's just take a couple minutes then and backtrack backtrack a little bit. Tell me, who are the traffickers? Tell me, how would I know, who a trafficker is?
Mm-hmm. Well, a trafficker can literally be anyone. They can be any ethnicity or race, any socioeconomic status, any gender. Anyone who benefits from the commercial exploitation of another person or facilitates that exploitation is a trafficker. They can be family members, friends, romantic partners, acquaintances, employers of domestic workers, labor recruiters, community leaders. Governments can be traffickers, gangs, even victims of trafficking, and business owners.
All right. Governments? Tell me a little bit more about that.
One of the ways governments can be traffickers, you actually see it a lot in other countries, such as China. So they'll have people who are arrested or in prisons, and they'll force them to work for the government.
What do you think makes the biggest portion of traffickers? Where do they come from, the biggest portion?
Well, a 2013 study by an organization called Covenant House found that immediate family members make up the largest portion of traffickers at 36%. And that's followed by boyfriends, or people who the traffickers say are their boyfriends, at 27%. The smallest portion was actually strangers, which contradicts every single thing that we learned from the Taken movies.
That's what I was just going to say. I am shocked to hear that 36% of traffickers are actually immediate family members.
Right.
So we're talking parents or uncles or sisters or brothers.
Yeah, a lot of times one of the things that I've heard from people who work with trafficking survivors is they'll have family members who are addicted to drugs and they don't have the money for the drugs, but they do have a daughter or a son, and they'll tell the dealer, hey, have sex with my kid and give me money or give me drugs.
So now I would have considered that as child abuse or domestic violence or some other form of a crime, if crime is the right word to use there. But trafficking would have been a word that entered into my thought process on this. How is it that more people aren't aware that that is actually trafficking and that's what's happening?
It's exactly what you're saying. We just don't know what trafficking is. It's something that a lot of people don't know, and it does look a lot like, domestic violence. It looks a lot like sex abuse, but it's that commercial element that people are missing. And it's also, like, I keep on saying commercial element. I want to emphasize, it doesn't have to be money. It doesn't have to be, I'm giving you $5. It just has to be something that the survivor finds of worth. It could be food. It could be a place to sleep at night. It could be, you give me an iPad. You give me, I get a ride in the front seat on the way to church or on the way to school.
Wow. I'm finding myself having trouble even coming up with questions. I'm just so taken aback by this information. Now, there are survivors of human trafficking, correct?
Right.
And obviously, from what you're telling me, anybody can be trafficked.
Right.
Anybody. So these survivors are our next door neighbors. They're people that we know. Our best friend could be a survivor, and we don't even know that.
Exactly.
Are there any particularly vulnerable populations that we should know about?
There are. Children under 18 are particularly vulnerable to trafficking. Worldwide, children under 18 make up approximately 49% of trafficking victims. Histories of sexual abuse, physical abuse, maltreatment, and neglect, these people are really attracted to traffickers because they've already had that grooming process that we see. The sexual grooming for sexual abuse is very common to the grooming for trafficking. Children with history of living in foster care or interaction with the juvenile justice system are really vulnerable. In New York State, approximately 86% of trafficked youth are either currently in contact or have had previous contact with child welfare systems.
Now, this isn't because they were in the family or foster system or the justice system. That's not what made them vulnerable. It's just you found the people that are in those systems are prone to be more vulnerable because something had led them to be in the system. It's
Right.
not the fault of the system.
Right. It's a lot of times the people who are interacting with the system have those histories of sexual abuse and physical abuse and the maltreatment. They come from abusive homes or whatever. So traffickers are very smart. Traffickers can realize what this person needs, and they're able to give it to them.
I would guess that runaways are probably pretty vulnerable.
Right. Runaway and homeless youth, very, very vulnerable to trafficking. 1 in 7 runaways reported by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children in 2013 were likely sex trafficking victims. One study estimates that 30% of shelter youth and 70% of street youth are survivors of commercial sexual exploitation. Another particularly vulnerable group is LGBTQ youth. They make up a statistically large portion of sex trafficking minor, possibly because they make up a disproportionately large portion of runaway and homeless youth populations. So one of the common things we see with runaway and homeless youth, on average, within 48 hours, they're approached by a trafficker. One of the things, again, this is commercial, and it doesn't matter if it's money. It could just be a piece of food or a place to sleep. So the traffickers are very smart. They know when the shelters are full. So they'll approach a kid and go, hey, all the shelters are full. If you do such and such sexual act for me, I'll give you a place to sleep tonight. And this is really attractive to these youth. And so they do it because they are surviving.
So is there something then that we should be doing? Is there something that I can do as a concerned citizen, knowing now that this is happening in my very own backyard? Is there a red flag I can see, or a sign, or a place I can call? Is there something that I can do to help with this, to put a stop to this, to try to lessen this load? This is a lot of information.
It is.
A lot of people that are being harmed by this.
It is. So one thing, we'll be talking more in the next section about red flags, how to identify people who've been trafficked and all that. One thing you can do, actually the most important thing you can do, is become aware of this problem, which we're starting right now, but continue to educate yourself. I'm only a student. I'm only just learning about this problem too. So educate yourself, educate your agency, educate other people who are working with these particular vulnerable populations. These are the clients that we're working with every day as social workers, and so you already have contact with them. But if you do suspect a minor is a victim of CSEC or trafficking, if the child's in immediate danger, call 911. That should be the first step with anyone. If you believe the minor is being trafficked by a parent or guardian, call the State Central Registry, call CPS. For any other additional services, supports, or referrals, there is a National Human Trafficking Resource Center, and their phone number is 1-888-373-7888. Or you can even text Be Free to 33733 for free and confidential assistance. This is for people who are being trafficked and service providers alike.
Those are excellent numbers. I think that we should all have into our phone books so that we have those numbers at hand. So I appreciate you giving those numbers. And I know that we're going to get into some more details in our session 2 next week. Is there anything that you would like to close with? Something that you would like just to reiterate to us about what we've talked about today? We only have a couple of minutes left. So
I think one of the major things to realize and to remember is these people aren't criminals, and they aren't people who should be in the juvenile justice. These are people who need help and need services, and, we need to change our view of quote-unquote teen prostitutes or kid prostitutes. Those things don't exist. We need to challenge our own misconceptions and our own biases with this population, and we need to be able to see the males and the females and the kids and the adults that we're working with that need our services and need our help.
So it's important to understand that these are victims.
Right.
These are not criminals. And I can see where it's it's easy to assume that they are just a criminal or doing a criminal act, but in fact they're being forced, they're being victimized, and that's I think the key thing that I learned today was to look at that in a different way and see who is a victim and who isn't a victim, and then what we can do about that. So we're at the end of our time for session 1. I'm really looking forward to session number 2, where Caitlin's going to be discussing how to identify trafficking survivors, how we can know who they are, and how we can address the trauma that they have been exposed to. So Caitlin, I thank you for sharing this topic with us, and I know it was a hard thing to talk about, it's a hard thing to listen to, but it is so important that we make people aware of this. This is an epidemic. This is one of the most rapidly rising criminal enterprises today, and it needs to be talked about, and January is the best time to do that. This is the awareness month. So I thank you all for staying with us while we talk about this subject, and we hope that you will join us again next week with session number 2 on human trafficking. So thank you again, Caitlin, for being with us, and I'll see you next week.
All right, thanks.
And thank you all for listening to Blog Talk Radio.